Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 809, June the 8th, 1987. I don't know how many of my listeners to World Watchers are watching CNN or C-SPAN, the video program, the entertainment of the week, the Iran-Contra hearings, or listening to Pacifica Radio. But for those who are fortunate enough to have the time to listen or videotape or record, which I'm doing, it is the most amazing experience I've ever had in all the years of my research. Every day there's one shock after the other, and it's really amazing, and I want to discuss some of that and share it with you, and some details that aren't coming across, of course, in the line of questioning. Last week on World Watchers, I left off by mentioning Richard von Weizsacker, the president of Germany, coming to Harvard University to give the graduation commencement speech or to be honored by Harvard University, and how his father was appointed by Heinrich Himmler to be on his personal staff of the Waffen-SS, and his father was promoted along with others to the very highest echelon of Adolf Hitler's regime, and then went on to represent Adolf Hitler at the Vatican. His son, who's the current guest at Harvard and the president of Germany, was a lawyer at that time period and defended his father and wrote about his father's work and his appeal and how ignorant he was of mass murders, even though he was the head of the Waffen-SS who ran the camps, and didn't understand about the atrocities and never really read about them and didn't know that Hitler was going this far and so forth. So he became an apologist for the behavior of the Waffen-SS and for his father and for Adolf Hitler. Now, in San Jose, there's a small college, very small, that invited Tom Hayden, the other side of the coin, to speak at their graduation ceremonies. And it seems that it's in an area where 40% of the graduating students come from the Vietnamese community. And the Vietnamese newspapers ran ads about Tom Hayden being a traitor. They said they hate him, that he was visiting with his wife, Jane Fonda, the North Vietnamese, and a gentleman, part of the Saigon Police Department, said they would have vigils and get up and stand up and walk away at the graduation when he came on. Somebody in San Jose made a remark, it appears the forces that corrupted Saigon and lost the war in Vietnam, who Mr. Hayden opposed, have regrouped in San Jose, and these people don't understand freedom in Saigon, and they still don't understand freedom in San Jose, and they said it would be a bad or fitting thing to remember the 58,000 who died in Vietnam by having Tom Hayden speak, but on the other hand, we might assume that 58,000 died protecting free speech, and therefore they got their way, and he stepped back. When you take that one step back, that I'm not going to come to graduation, I'm going to take orders from you after he was invited to be there by people who've been invited to this country, you are starting a process by which there's no returning if you bow down to these kinds of pressures. And he doesn't have to apologize for what he did then, because that Vietnamese administration was so horrible. The people themselves didn't like them or want them, and that's why they were forced to flee. So Harvard has Richard von Weizsacker with nobody standing up or leaving or objecting, evidently, and a little two-year college in San Jose can't have Tom Hayden speaking, whereas this is the 20th year since the large anti-war movement began, and the people who protested the war were absolutely right, it seems, about the things that we were doing and that the Saigon officials were doing. This morning there was a Britton, let me see if I can pronounce it, Scioroni, on the telly and on the radio, a witness before the Iran-Contra group, talking about a very questionable document, the Boland Amendment, how it applied to the President or the National Security Council as against just the CIA or Defense Department. And Mr. Scioroni is presently the attorney for the Intelligence Oversight Board that advises the President whether the actions he's taking are legal or illegal. And it was just amazing to hear him get on the stand and show his credentials, the lack of credentials, by which the chief attorney and this one attorney, he has a desk in the executive office, the old executive office suite, close to the CIA and National Security Council, and he's cozy with all of them. And they went into his background, upon which he based the decision that the Bolin Amendment didn't apply to the National Security Council, but then he didn't spread it around among other people. He locked it in his safe, and nobody saw it. So I'm wondering if it was an accessory after the fact. But Mr. Bolin, Representative Bolin, said, I found Mr. Scioroni's testimony to be useful and instructive, and it illustrates how legal opinions were used by the White House. When there were articles in the New York Times, one particularly August the 8th, 1985, that Oliver North was supplying the Contras with military aid, he called Oliver North in and he said, did you do it? And he said, no, he didn't. So he said, I talked with him for 5 minutes. Then he called Robert McFarlane in and said, are you doing these things? And they talked for 30 minutes, and the National Security Advisor said no. So he was satisfied. This is the Intelligence Oversight Board. He was perfectly satisfied with that answer, and then it dropped there, and in his safe was a document saying that the NSC did not have to obey the rules of the Bolin Amendment. And Representative Sarborn said, and they brought this up earlier, I'm interested in how you got your job. How much do you earn? And he said $62,000 a year. And earlier he said he graduated from UCLA Law School, and it took 4 or 5 years to pass the bar. And so he said he took his California bar, and he lost. He didn't pass it. And he went to the Hoover Institute under Mr. Campbell, who was one of the 3 people on the Intelligence Oversight Board. He went right with him to Washington, so he was with his boss. Instead of overseeing him, he was his boss. And then he took the California bar again and failed. Then he went to work for the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, which is a hawkish institute with persons, ready to make an invasion of Russia if necessary, and of course to wipe out the Nicaraguan forces there, the Sandinistas. So he went to the American Enterprise Institute, and he took the Washington bar, and he failed, and he took it again, and he failed, and they told him if he goes to Pennsylvania, go to Philadelphia and take it, then you can come back to Washington. So he did that, and they asked him how he got the job. Where was there a description of your qualifications? And he said no, he got it. Somebody ahead of him told him about it, so he simply applied and slipped into the job. And they said, did you start this job as a lawyer? Because the requirement was that you had to be a certified lawyer. And he said no, that he took the bar in July, and the next day went to work for the Intelligence Oversight Board, but he only had been had taken the test in Philadelphia. This was his 5th time at the test, but he started to work the day after he took the test, and he didn't hear until the fall whether or not he had passed it, and it was illegal, of course, to hire. The stipulations were that they wanted an attorney, and he never practiced law and did any kind of discovery and never worked with covert action. And lucky for him, he passed the bar in July, rather in the fall, but he was already working for the Intelligence Oversight Board, and they asked him how many people you have to investigate whether or not these activities would be illegal, to warn the president or to tell the Justice Department to pursue them, and FBI to go into them and see if there's illegalities. And he skirted around the possibility that he would tell them. He said he only had one secretary. It was him and his secretary that were the Intelligence Oversight Board, and they asked him, did you go to the press? And this is very significant. Did you go to the source of the press, the New York Times article, August the 8th, 1985, and asked them where they got the information? And he said, we don't contact the press. So the only thing that is true in these administrations is what they find for themselves. And through the whole entire Iran-Contra hearings, the fact came up that a lot of people, Robert McFarlane and the whole team, I could list all 8 or 10 that have been called so far, would say, I learned it in the newspaper. I didn't know this. As a matter of fact, the worst extension of that whole newspaper story was when Albert Hakim was telling about sending Mr. Zucker from Geneva, Switzerland, to Pennsylvania, where his offices are also in Pennsylvania. Maybe they write the law degree for these people. And he was meeting with Oliver North's wife, who went from Virginia to Pennsylvania to meet him. And Mr. Hakim, Albert Hakim, is saying how much he loves Ollie and loves the family, and was setting up money for the children. And they asked him, do you know the name of his wife? He never met her, didn't know her. He said, I read it in the Washington Post this morning. It's Betsy. So that's where they get their information, the New York Times and Washington Post. But they're not allowed to use it as information to be pursued, and these diligent reporters are getting all these stories, and the intelligence community only tells you what they want to know, and anything that comes from the outside didn't happen unless they get the kosher seal that they are forced to go into it. So that was very revealing that they don't go to the source of the newspaper and find out if it's wrong. Now, this morning's Jack Anderson column it's about George Bush. Bush is implicated, and of course he's implicated. He's implicated sitting on the National Security Council while this is going on as vice president. He's linked to the Iranian affair, the Contra affair. But Jack Anderson said that his assistant, of course, Donald Gregg, was meeting with Mr. Gomez Rodriguez. And it's interesting that CIA agent Gomez Felix Rodriguez Dash, or Max Gomez, the same person with the two names. It's interesting that the documents about Gomez Dash Rodriguez are the things that possibly will bring George Bush down, because I've known for years, or was told for years, the relationship of George Bush to Klaus Barbie, and even the allegations or the stories that he met him in San Francisco, which have never, of course, been proven. I've mentioned a lot of times. And Gomez Dash Rodriguez, I've gone into his role, and I have a lot more I will detail one of these weeks pretty soon on killing Che Guevara along with Klaus Barbie. So it's interesting that the memos that involve George Bush and his office and Mr. Gomez Dash Rodriguez and his assistant, Mr. Gregg, will bring Bush out of office after he was at least bring him down out of running or winning the presidency. I don't know if they'll kick him out like they did Agnew. I don't know how far this team is willing to go. They not feel with energetic reasons to scold these people for doing the things they did. But the noose around his neck is the Gomez Dash Rodriguez one, which was evident from the moment that Mr. Hassenfuss landed in the grass in Nicaragua, and he opened his newborn eyes and said, Robert Owen and Gomez Dash Rodriguez, and that led right to the door of George Bush. And the key to the George Bush Gomez Dash Rodriguez has to do with a man named William Hetrick, who I've described on the air before. The San Francisco Chronicle had an article about him August 25th, 1984. This is the man, the pilot, that was charged with drug smuggling, who was arrested in Miami and pleaded, he was taken to Los Angeles then, and he pleaded that he would serve his time if his two sons, Buzz and Jinx, his stepson, James Coward, who were in business with him, monkey business with him, were not indicted. And this man, this Hetrick, and his links to Edwin Wilson would be the links of George Bush to Klaus Barbie and the cocaine that came in from Klaus Barbie to John DeLorean. But I had that on the air quite a few years ago already. It's been 4 years, 3 years, going on 4. And I believe that this story is the bottom line, and I mention it because as these other persons made the circle to close in on George Bush, someday in our lifetime we're going to see that. Now, you've been reading a lot of the things that Albert Hakim has been saying, and those of you who get parts of the hearings know that he was a pretty dangerous man who had unlimited money and is holding on to millions and doesn't intend to give them up. And one of the scary things about Hakim, he was talking about the importance of the hostages, getting them home for the election in 1986 of the Republicans in the Senate and House. And evidently the big hunks of money for the hostages was to build up the psychological support which Ronald Reagan wants for those sweeping gestures of the hostages marching home, so he wouldn't have to suffer with the same problems that Jimmy Carter had. Now, with all their secret dealings, and there's no time in 1 hour a week to even go into them, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times, February 14th, 1987, about Albert Hakim, and it tells, among other things, which I'll go into, he married a Korean woman just in 1982, 1 year before the KAL went down. But Albert Hakim was working with members of Congress, and this article from the LA Times said that when Richard Secord retired from the Air Force in 1983, and of course we know he went on to those special operation groups, he became a director of Stanford Technology, a position he kept until December, and his contacts had brought him promises of deals. In 1984, this is when Ronald Reagan was reelected, Ernie Garcia, the Sergeant of Arms for the Senate, asked Secord and Stanford Technology to assess the U.S. capital needs. This is like James McCord, who was caught at Watergate, being chief of security for the CIA compound and the committee to re-elect the president. But this gentleman, Ernie Garcia, was considering Secord and Hakim to be in charge of the security for the United States Capitol. The article goes on, Stanford Technology prepared the report for free in hopes that they would have a leg up when the Senate was ready to grant a contract for providing the Capitol for security. But now the project is dormant because the Senate changed hands last month from Republican to Democrat. So the job that would be coming up for chief of security for the Capitol, for the Senate and House, could be handled by Secord and Hakim, who handled the security and the police, the Savak for the Shah of Iran, worked together in Iran, and these men would have access through every door and every person to letters of congressmen, to things they say, to speeches they're going to give, to people they see. Imagine what access they would have if they were assigned the job of being in charge of the security for the capital of Washington, D.C., working out of Switzerland with various banking institutions and dummy fronts. And goodness knows, as I say, what would happen to the electoral process. We're moving quickly to the electoral process in Germany in 1933. But given that little piece of information, imagine what else would happen. Now, there was an article, February 26, 1987, Oliver North described as a central figure in the Contra Fund. And I want to bring this up because the testimony that they're citing was Mrs. McLaughlin, who surfaced. She worked for Carl Spitz Chanell, the conservative fundraiser who was close to Fawn Hall, to Ollie North, Robert Owen, the whole inner team. He was the man raising money for the electoral process to defeat the Democrats, working night and day. So people like Secord and Hakim, who handled their money in Switzerland, would have the security of the Capitol. And Mrs. McLaughlin said that she and her colleagues at the office often referred to Colonel North as the code name Green. In the interviews, she talked about meetings, and they were green meetings. The quote is green meetings that Oliver North used. And today, Fawn Hall testified that the name Green was one of the names used by Ollie North. Now, people associate green with money, and the Spitz Channel office was raising the money to change the electoral process, or the House and Senate, and it is very important to know where the money was deposited, again with Mr. Willlard Zucker, who was given the money, whether it was from various countries or private individuals like Mrs. Garwood and Joseph Kerr, or whether it was allegedly coming in from Brunei for the Contras or whatever purposes. Remember, that money was supposed to be 30% for the Contras, and nobody discussed at the hearings who got the other 70%, which is $7 million, $3 million for the Contras and $7 million undisclosed. And there is a lot of money that went through the offices, millions and billions of Willlard Zucker and approximately $43 million of Albert Hakim. So green is money. And the discussions these last days have been about money and Ollie North and the enterprise and people like the National Security Council advisor and Robert McFarlane, and then Admiral Poindexter, putting it into the hands of Willlard Zucker. Now, Hakim used Willlard Zucker. Zucker was a former official of the Internal Revenue in the United States who moved to Switzerland. Later, he was an investment partner who took over the IOS, the Bernie Cornfield operation, and worked with Robert Vesco when he stepped into that space. Vesco having absconded with over $200 million, I believe it was, so there's another little bit of money. Now, Ronald Reagan's closest friend in California, and until he passed away, was Alfred Bloomingdale, who shared a mistress, Vicki Morgan, with Bernie Cornfield simultaneously. And at this time, Bernie Cornfield was close to Mr. Zucker and Robert Vesco, and he was on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. He was on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board with Edward Bennett Williams, who is one of the attorneys for Robert Vesco. And that's very important for this story as it evolves. And Roy Cohn also sat on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, a longtime associate of Ronald Reagan's and the House Un-Americans activity, an attorney for Senator Joe McCarthy, and he was probably the first person out of that Spitz Chanell office that died of AIDS. He was on the board of Western Goals, as well as serving in the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Now, Roy Cohn was close to Spitz Chanell in the circle, raising the money, which he was able to do too. He had a lot of clients who were organized crime, some of the biggies of New York City and around the world, and he served, as I say, with Western Goals and Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Now, Robert Vesco, the associate of Edward Bennett Williams, and this takes a little thinking, I'll have to diagram it for you, the client, as I say, of Edward Bennett Williams, and also of Arthur Lyman, who's the chief counsel on this investigation of the Iran-Contra, and also a partner with Willard Zucker, who handles all their money, Vesco and another association business partner that also brought in a lot of money, and that was Mr. Carlos Lehder Rivas, who's now sitting in a jail, the cocaine king from Colombia. And as I've mentioned before, Rivas' partner with Vesco, he had several partners. One is Pablo Escobar and Jorge Osha, two defendants in the Christic Institute that worked with Albert Hakim, also a defendant, Richard Secord, Thomas Cline's, coming right out of the same operation that Mr. Hakim is talking about and Mr. Dutton worked for, Robert Dutton worked for. So that Vesco touches all these bases and touches the banking field of the persons who are going to take the NSC money and deposit it there, and also is the client of a person, Edward Bennett Williams, on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. So that the President is a stone's throw away in his NSC group, in his operations, where Ollie North taps into Hakim and Secord, and the money goes into Zucker. It's a web that's been going on for a long, long time, and it taps directly into those people who've been fingered by the Christic Institute as the gun runners, the assassins, and their history webs, as I say, a long, long time. So with Vesco, the partner of Zucker, we heard a lot about Zucker's relationship to Albert Hakim this past week, but not a lot about who Mr. Zucker is or how Mr. Zucker happens to be meeting with Mrs. Ollie North, who goes from Virginia to Philadelphia. We know she's going there to make arrangements of some kind to get a hunk of money for her adorable husband, whose nickname is Belly Button. But Zucker is not identified, and yet Mrs. North goes there, and they should have given a little background that his client is Robert Vesco, or his business partner is Robert Vesco, who's the partner with the cocaine group down in Colombia. So, but anyway, in this network of people, this Carlos Lehder Rivas also used the name Green, just as Ollie North was called Green, and we're talking again about a lot of money. Carlos Lehder Rivas had a newspaper in Colombia that was green. It was printed on green paper. It had green ink, and he was directly tied into what he called the Green Nazi Party because they're fanatical environmentalists. So green could mean environment and green could mean money, but the paper was filled with anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, praised Adolf Hitler, wanted to legalize drugs, want a healthier race, and get into some nice genocide by cleaning out the race, which was the original goal of Hitler when he was stopped for a few years. Now, as well as green meaning money, the Sultan of Brunei was tapped, and I'll go into that. As I say, the 3 million would go to Contras, and 7 would be floating around, and they don't explain where that is. In the past week, they discovered, and Mr. Hakim testified, where Brunei's money was deposited. It was in the Credit Suisse account, and they almost linked it to Mr. Zucker. We won't know whether or not that is the Zucker who got the Sultan's money that was meant to be deposited and never got to the Contras, because they asked Mr. Hakim how old Mr. Zucker was, and they asked him if his wife was a doctor, and one of the members of the Iran-Contra panel asked what are the mathematical chances of the man getting the $10 million from the Sultan, who is that same age and whose wife is a doctor in the same city, in the same bank, Credit Suisse, and they didn't say it, but I read in the newspaper the same number. how did this get mixed up? And it's very important to know if the Sultan really meant, he said he didn't mean to arm the Contras, but this was missing a long time and was located in the Credit Suisse, and they're holding back the name of the person whose bank account it was in. Also, speaking of green money, green like Carlos Lehder Rivas or Ollie North's name is green. Albert Hakim said that he refused to turn over $8 million because it belongs to the enterprise. He said, I never said I was a humanitarian, I'm in business, and he's holding $8 million. And then when the question came up, where did you find it? He said, well, Mr. Zucker had to go to banks all over the world and trace it from various places all over the world. And it ended up in the bank, in the trading company or financial establishment of Merrill Lynch. Now, Merrill Lynch was involved with the narcotics traffic and the deposit of Colombian narcotics, such as Mr. Escobar and Mr. Lehder Rivas and Jorge Osha. And this came out in drug trials investigations in Washington, D.C. that were linked to the pizza parlors where our Donald Reagan, the chief of staff of the White House and former Secretary of the Treasury, was named by Judge Kaufman as being a repository of these exact accounts of these people. So the drug question is not coming out very much, but I want to bring it out because green is the name of Mr. Rivas, it's the name of Ollie North, it's one of them, and they have a lot in common through the National Security Council in Switzerland, and their contacts even going to the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Now, Edwin Wilson was a partner of Albert Hakim and Thomas Cline's and Richard Secord at the original TCI, Stanford Technology. And Edwin Wilson was brought to the United States from Switzerland by someone he trusted, Robert Keiser, and I've talked about him before. And Robert Kaiser's real name is Ernest von Keiser from the Wehrmacht, worked in Hitler's army, moved to the United States, came from Sao Paulo, Brazil, where he lives most of the time, and he was working for the CIA, the National Security Council, the DIA, and then he was shot in Washington when he was carrying papers about Robert Vesco, and he also worked with Robert Vesco. At that point, when he was shot in the shoulder, he left the United States and is living in Germany. So Mr. Wehrmacht Keiser and Edwin Wilson and these various characters, as well as Edward Bennett Williams and Mr. Albert Hakim and Mr. Willlard Zucker, who funds the North family on the side, which they brought up as real extortion, really owning the man who has the door right next to the White House. There is a lot of green floating around, and so these men use the name green, and I believe that there are a lot of things that this committee will never get out, but there will be people writing books for a long, long time, and eventually have to go to the Merrill Lynch drug connections, and the fact that all of a sudden the $8 million of Albert Hakim is sitting in the account of Merrill Lynch, but he said quite adamantly it will not be released. In this past December 1986, there was a long article about this Zucker. Many of you don't know his name, and I thought I'd had it on the program a lot, but this article is titled American Lawyer Linked to North Associates. And sometimes it's more fun to read these older articles. This one coming out a half a year ago after hearing the testimony of Hakim and Secord and Dutton. This article talks about in Geneva the specialist who invests money, this 52-year-old attorney Willlard Zucker, the director of a Swiss finance company, the CSF, the Compagnie des Services Judiciaires, and how they deposit for various persons around the world. And that was made quite clear by Hakim. Once you give it to Zucker, it's a secret. And this article says that he had at least 7 companies that are operating out of his CSF that are tied to the National Security Council and to the likes of Secord and Hakim, particularly Secord as one of the middlemen. And the article tells about his relationship to those 2 key players, Secord and Hakim, and going back to their California firm, the Stanford Technology Trading, and Credit Suisse, which is also the repository of the Sultan's money, that branch in Switzerland. And this article tells about the relationship when Secord and Hakim liquidated one firm in 1984 and formed another subsidiary. They liquidated the Geneva and started this Stanford Technology Group, and its offices were still with Mr. Zucker in Switzerland, that the banking and money of these people came out with Zucker's offices, and that even though Secord and Hakim merged their various companies, Hakim and Secord operated everywhere, and it lists all over the world from the Sudan to California, and Zucker was always their banker. And this article in the Washington Post, it's dated December the 14th, said Zucker came to Switzerland in 1970, that was 2 years after Nixon was elected, to work for the defunct IOS that had gone bankrupt, and it was taken over by financier Robert Vesco, and that's when Vesco took over when Bernie Cornfeld closed up. And the article goes on to say how they worked together, Vesco and Zucker, and the relationship of Hakim and Secord to their organizations. The article says that Mohammed Malik Ali, a Sudanese who runs a security device company, when he wants to recover some money from Secord and Hakim, he's told to call a number in Geneva and ask for Madame Caroline, and then he gets the phone number of Zucker. And that these people, as I say, work all over the world, and the legwork is done by Hakim and Secord, and Zucker is the banker, and he's also the banker and associate of Robert Vesco. I'll take a 1-minute break and go back to another story of a lot of money, because there's a lot of green floating around and a lot of dirty deals that really should be forced to be followed, but won't do, not in these hearings at least. This is Mae Brussell, and it is the second half of World Watchers, program number 809. If you watched Albert Hakim on television or in the news or heard him at all last week, he had a wonderful counterpart that preceded him, Elliot Abrams, an arrogant person, again illustrating that the decisions are made in the White House. Everybody's been on the stand. Makes it quite clear that Congress is just a big turd waiting to be thrown away, that they make their own decisions, that they're the best patriots, they have their reasons and motives. And Elliot Abrams, the deputy head of the State Department right under George Shultz for Central American Affairs, was seemed to be tapped right away for getting money from the Sultan of Brunei. So he was on the stand to testify. As it turns out, actually, George Shultz was the one who tapped the Sultan first. But the arrogance of these people is epitomized in the way they are asked to describe certain situations, like Robert McFarlane was asked about Mr. Garbanovar, and he said, well, the Iranians are nothing but rug merchants. Just that sweeping kind of a sneer. So they asked Elliot Abrams, you happen to solicit money from the Sultan. How did you happen to go to the Sultan for this? The money was supposed to go, of course, to Lake Resources, which is the Willlard Zucker account, of course. And this is what he said. From a list of potential donors, the officials struck out all pro-Soviets. They didn't want any leftists giving money for the Contras. And they ruled out right-wing dictatorships, which I don't know why he objects to, because then they went on with John Singlaub to get money from the Philippines when the Marcos were around, in South Korea and Taiwan. The only one left out was Zia of Pakistan and Pinochet, and they might have done under the table, but they didn't want any right-wing dictatorships because they're putting in, you understand, this democracy down there. So he said they wanted nations that were dependent. They didn't want nations that were dependent on U.S. aid, which is another lie, because they went to Honduras and then threatened them they'd be cut off, and they went to Mexico and threatened them, and they went to Costa Rica and threatened them, and Guatemala threatened them. So there is evidence of extortion, of saying you won't get any aid unless you go along with what we're doing. So the dictators and the dependence is a lie. And he talked about you couldn't go to poverty-stricken. They wouldn't be interested in Nicaragua. So two countries remained. One was Venezuela, and I thought would not do this. So Abrams told the chuckling lawmakers, this is very funny. He said, then you're down to Brunei. Well, the result was that the Sultan, who gave the money and it was finally located, asked this week that he wants his money back. Right after that, there was an article in the newspaper following that June 3rd. Brunei Sultan wants his $10 million donation returned. And no wonder he wants it returned. He was the court of last resort, and here's a man testifying under oath that we only used him because he was the last one. Well, I think Mr. Abrams went to too much trouble to explain why he wanted the Sultan of Brunei, and he should have just shut his mouth and said, well, the Sultan's a friend of ours, and we're friendly, and so why not ask? So in the process of the money getting lost and then being found in identical account numbers in Switzerland at the Credit Suisse account, and the Sultan turning down the offer afterwards, I'd like to go to the question of Brunei and why Elliot Abrams and George Shultz went to them. Now, there is this Intelligence Review magazine, newspaper. It's a private subscription, and I've had it on the air, the address before, called ADI, and it comes out of Paris, and it's translated and sent to subscribers. And just recently, they had an article titled Brunei Shell, How Brunei Oil Ends Up in South Africa. And there is an embargo against South Africa, but this is the way that the national security and the president get around these embargoes. There was an embargo against sending arms to Iran, but that doesn't matter to them at all. And the article is titled, Shell Sells to Marubeni, which is a Japanese firm. Marubeni resells to Mark Rich, and Mark Rich supplies South Africa. Now, many of you remember the broadcast. I hope you do, or you're new. I'll refresh you with some articles that I've done, some articles that I had on the air, and also new ones, and broadcasts I've done on Mark Rich. And this is what came out of France. Since 1983, and of course this is when Reagan starts escalating with his hanky-panky. He's been in office since March 81. Since 1983, the Brunei Shell Petroleum Company has been selling crude oil to the Japanese trading firm Marubeni. Most of this oil was ostensibly desired for the United States. We were buying the Sultan's oil. However, Marubeni resold the oil to commodities trader Mark Rich, who eventually sold it to South Africa. Mark Rich, a resident of Zug, Switzerland, is well known as an oil supplier to South Africa. The total volume of crude oil sold by Mark Rich to South Africa since 1983 to 1987, or rather October 86, is about 2.5 million tons. And at the end of January in 1987, the Shipping Research Bureau published a survey on oil deliveries to South Africa, which sailed from Brunei. So this was put out in Europe about Brunei government using various ships from Japan, and the Shipping Research Bureau has identified no direct deliveries of Shell, which is from the Netherlands, the Queen Juliana and Prince Bernhard, but the continuous use of 23 tankers owned and managed by Shell that did deliver to South Africa. Now, Queen Juliana and Prince Bernhard are a couple on in years. He was identified as part of the Lockheed spying scandal, got millions of dollars, and he was a member of Hitler's Waffen-SS, as was Mr. Richard von Weizsacker's father, Ernest von Weizsacker, as Otto von Bolschwing, all of them from the same organization. And then another article followed that in the United States from the People's Daily World, January 29th. Mostly the same story. Brunei charged with covert sale of oil to South Africa. The Dutch anti-apartheid organization charged this week large amounts of oil from Brunei, the Southeast Asian Sultanate tied to Iran Gate. Surfaces through the Shipping Research Bureau is a Netherlands-based group that has exposed secret oil traffic, and the same gentleman who put up $10 million donation to the Nicaraguan Contras, described as the world's richest individual. I guess he replaced Daniel Ludwig in America, or Mr. Khashoggi, who's now $50 million in debt to the Sultan of Brunei, if you can believe that, in the last 1 month. This group went on and identified 56 deliveries of oil to South Africa, and it goes on to say this may be an even bigger scandal under investigation by the Brunei government, because large quantities of oil have disappeared, were unaccounted for. Although the official records show the oil was sold for delivery to the United States, in reality a smaller group of tankers went here. The remainder went to South Africa by way of Japanese ships. Speaking of large stories, as well as the oil to South Africa against the embargo, that includes Mark Rich's involvement, and he's very closely associated to Henry Kissinger. I will get on next week, hopefully, to the connections of George Bush to the PTL, and the scandal, maybe many of you have seen it, and goes directly to Lynn Nofziger, who was a White House aide at the time These transactions were taking place. Who is under question with the Weizsacker Corporation? The Weizsacker is now wedded to the PTL, to George Bush, and a friend wanted to know if I was going to do parts of that this evening, but it's so large I probably have to take an hour, 3/4 of an hour, to go into the links of Edwin Meese and Lynn Weizsacker, who's now on the salary of Spitz Chanell, who pleaded guilty, the first guilty plea to the Iran-Contra affair, residing under their cloak. And also Weizsacker is linked to Fairchild in investigations. Now, in Fairchild, Schlumberger was the original corporation that formed TCI that Albert Hakim brought when he came over from Europe, from Iran. And I also want to do another half hour or 3/4 of an hour on Albert Hakim, how he got his money from William Sullivan and the Olin Foundation and went from Iran, putting his cash from Iran into the accounts of Willlard, Zucker in Switzerland, and came out to Los Gatos, California, to buy the Otto von Bolschwing network that was formed, the TCI that became the Stanford Technology Trading Group. So those are two subjects that are big, and I bring those up now just to let you know that the Weizsacker, the wedding of the PTL to the White House, is very, very important to George Bush. But to just say that this article is saying that the linkage of Brunei oil to South Africa and the Royal Dutch family with the embargoes against the oil to South Africa may turn out to be a very big item. This article, last article on this exposure, South Africa, says another Brunei imposed, although Brunei imposed an embargo on oil sales to South Africa as early as 1982, they circumvented the embargo by selling it to intermediaries, as I say, to the Marabini, the Japanese firm, and Mark Rich, the U.S. dealer in Switzerland. So nothing is sacred. They also transported the oil, the Lorenzens dairy shipping from Norway and the Neptune Orient lines of Singapore. So Singapore and Norway take the oil of Brunei when they have an embargo against oil to South Africa to the Royal Dutch Shell, and Prince Bernhard is the chairman of the Bilderbergers that meets every year, the royal potentates who decide which countries will be overthrown within a one more year time. And so this is the way they circumvent situations which I've had on the air for many, many years, but I think they become more meaningful as you see the operatives on the screen and read the articles, and I hope you're reading as much as you can about these characters. I'm taping their testimony. Maybe I'll be able to get these tape cassettes available to you. But just reading this in January isn't as meaningful as it is now to see how they use all these methods to circumvent any bill in Congress or any desire of the elected population, or how Brunei has an embargo and tells their people, although they don't have to count to their people, and the Netherlands has another embargo in the United States, but oil flows just the same, and they just tap whichever allies they want. So it's natural that Brunei would be tapped for this operation, because you could also smear them in some ways, and it did come out with the illegal oil going to South Africa, and when it comes out, it'll involve all of us. Now, the Sultan of Brunei said right away when the exposures began to come out, by January 16th, I didn't send any money to the Contras, and Jack Anderson sent his assistant to go see him, and he said emphatically that, of course, you don't know what their interpretation is. It was humanitarian. I didn't send it for weapons. And then a secret report came out that the $10 million was sent to a secret Swiss bank account, all by secret again. And the Sultan said he had no idea where the money went, but they won't give the name of the person who did get the money and drew the interest. And so the problem of dividing up hasn't been dealt with yet. It just came in the testimonies, I said before. If it was received in the right hands, Albert Hakim said, $3 million for the Contras. Now, the other $7 million goes into the enterprise. The $6 million profit from the Iranian arms goes into the enterprise, so that's $15 million. And you start adding up where their profits come from all over the world, or how much they have, and you'd be busy for a lifetime. Now, Mark Rich he's a commodities trader, and he was a partner with Marvin Davis, who owns our Pebble Beach 100%. They both bought 20th Century Fox, and Mr. Rich had assets that had nothing to do with Fox Studio. They were kept over in Europe, and he was very, very wealthy and owed the United States government many taxes. and he was introduced to Fox Studio by Denver oil man Marvin Davis, a very close friend of Henry Kissinger's, and they formed a private company, and then they bought 20th Century Fox, and one section of 20th Century Fox was one. It wasn't 50-50. There was like 50 for one person, Marvin Davis, and 30 for Mark Rich, and then 20% belonged to Chris Kraft, and the attorney for that was Arthur Lyman and Simon Rifkin, the attorneys for Chris Kraft. And so they were, and DeLorean was on the board of Chris Kraft, and I don't want to confuse you, and I've done broadcasts a long time ago. Many of you don't remember them, but I just bring these names out because what goes around comes around, and as these names of Brunei and Elliot Abrams and George Schultz come out, and the relationship to Mark Rich, you have to get back into who Mark Rich is. And of course, the Los Angeles Herald had an article in 1982, 5 years ago, that he's wealthy and secretive. You better believe that. He controls tens of thousands of gallons of crude oil and made a big killing during the crude oil crisis caused by the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War. Much of it from Nigeria. As a result, he made millions of dollars. And he was into the oil business with Iran and Iraq. And Henry Kissinger, who represented the financial interests of the Shah of Iran, as well as William Rogers, who was the attorney for the Shah. Kissinger and William Rogers were on the board of 20th Century Fox with Marvin Davis and Mark Rich, who bought it, and they were involved with millions that they didn't pay their taxes on, and Mark Rich has to stay out of the country. But the attorney for Mark Rich is Edward Bennett Williams on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, the attorney for Robert Vesco again. Vesco, the partner of Willard Zucker, and maybe I'm going too fast. I hope I'm not, but I know I am. But I think you get the overtones of these people involved with Iran, involved with oil, and Henry Kissinger was sending oil, both getting oil from the Shah and sending oil at the time of Khomeini with Mark Rich, and they were using their profits for their own personal use without paying any taxes in the United States and writing it off as if they were losing money where they actually weren't. They said they were making $12 a barrel, they were making 30, and of course were making a big profit. I have a friend in San Francisco who takes the financial papers and sends me marvelous articles on Mark Rich, which I've been waiting to use, and they didn't fit in the right time and place, but I might cite a few of them so you can look them up, because I can't put them all in the air, but I will share a lot of them with you. One is from Forbes magazine called Greed Incorporated. And the reason I bring it up now, again, this is Fortune, December 29th, 1986. It's funny that this came out just at a time after Mr. Hassanfuss landed and just before the Iran-Iraq story broke. Because of the link of Brunei to Mark Rich, I'm wondering if the people who wrote this realized for Forbes that these connections would be coming out. The title above that is, while he whines to the media about being exiled from the United States, tax dodger Mark Rich and his family and pals build the control of the world aluminum market. And it says he gave an interview with Fortune magazine, the fugitive tax dodger, living in Zug, Switzerland, but he didn't tell his interviewers that he was buying up the total control of the world aluminum market, the chunk of it. They're trying to buy up independent smelter, independent suppliers of raw materials for aluminum. Big integrated companies like Alcan and Alcoas are outside their net, but what remains is several $1 billion, and they influence the price of the industry. And Rich and Green, both 52 years old, who live in Switzerland, were wanted on a 65-count criminal indictment of the U.S. Justice Department. Criminal evasion was $48 million, and then he paid millions of dollars of fine. He hasn't yet paid those taxes for a huge illegal oil pricing system, and his thirst for profit is so great and insatiable that he's buying up all the aluminum in the world except for the two companies. Last month, and this is in November of '86, just when Hassanfuss was landing on the grass, the Malaysian government disclosed that in the early 1980s it enlisted Rich to manipulate the world tin market. Tin prices surged in July '81 until February '82, and it says now the aluminum market is being bought up by Rich. He exerts a powerful influence of world production of bauxite and manipulates and moves into the world prices of aluminum and semi-refined ore. Cynical and greedy they may be, but Rich and Green, his partner, are brilliant traders in the commodities, and they deal, as I say, in bauxite, aluminum, ingot in Brazil, Egypt, Jamaica, Venezuela, Australia, Japan, and so forth. And this is an article about their profits and where they move in which countries. And Forbes estimates that Rich's Mark Rich and Company, AG, and Associates are earning about $150 million a year on aluminum-related transactions, and that's just a drop in the bucket to the other things that they do. That's buying up the aluminum. There is a new book that came out it was a year and a half ago, 1985, called Metal Men. I have it, Mark Rich and the $10 Billion Scam by A. Craig Copetus, and you might get that book, The Metal Men, Mark Rich. The book review was titled Rich and Infamous, How Mark Made His Mint, and it tells of Mark Rich's holdings of more than $200 million, born in Antwerp, Belgium, and escaped from Europe and came to the United States in the early 40s, as did the Kissinger family and Peter Drucker and Fritz Kramer, and it tells about how he accumulated so many millions of dollars. He used bribery for payoffs, and Hakim, of course, used those. That was one of his private ways of accumulating money. He called them chocolates. One top trader, Robbie Lichtenstein, spent $25,000 a year on call girls for customers. He died at the age of 46. After making immense profits buying oil from the Shah of Iran, Mr. Rich turned around to buying from the Ayatollah Khomeini, defying the U.S. embargo against supporting Khomeini. Metal Men cites insider trading said he in turn sent weapons from Thailand and Spain to Mr. Khomeini in return for that oil. And it tells about his employees, 1,000 employees in dozens of countries, and a network that is vast. Well, this is the enterprise. These people all tap in with the same attorneys and bankers and associates into the enterprise. If you think the enterprise is big, these are just little tippy views of what Hakim calls the enterprise. And then it goes on to say that Mr. Green, his partner, pranced around New York and applauded himself, swapping 14 Boeing 747s to the Saudis in return for oil then that he would send to Israel. So nobody's really suffering except the people who fight these wars. And then it goes on to say Rich paid a fine of $50,000 a day until certain documents were produced from Switzerland, and that was quite a bit of money. It added up to a fine of $150 million that wasn't tax deductible. And this book tells about his relationship in accumulating money and with people. And again, another person that he worked with in Bangkok set up these houses of prostitution. And Mr. Mantell, Mr. Rich's, the man, tells the story of Mr. Rich's man in Bangkok who was tortured and killed. And, of course, just in a small amount of time in this book, it goes into the way that he built his oil empire with Marvin Davis, a very, very wealthy man. As I say, owns Pebble Beach and sold his 20th Century Fox to Mr. Murdoch from Australia and Great Britain. Interestingly enough, Mr. Vesco ties into Mark Rich and this whole syndicate, but in the book Vesco, the Infernal Money-Making Machine by Michael Dorman, it tells on page 23, in 1961, Vesco began selling products manufactured by a small New Jersey firm called Bergen Captive Seal Corporation. It was involved with, again, aluminum. It was an aluminum company, and he sold aluminum products. And International Controls Corporation was another private company he worked with, and Captive Seal Corporation in New Jersey, a subsidiary of International Controls, headquartered in Fairfield, New Jersey. And his career began with a small company that involved aluminum. And so it's interesting that these people's lives merge and they don't get very far from these products that they started with and built these fortunes. And again, Vesco is described as a mystery person. Nobody knows how he got all his money, and the federal investigators have tried to go into his background, how he came into town with a little small house and a tacky old car, and he leaves a year later with a new Lincoln Continental, and these people just picked up millions and millions and you can get right into the commodity markets, into the stock exchange, into the large narcotics traffic and aluminum and grains and all the various industries that people depend upon. And a lot of them are run by these kind of persons, like Hakim and Secord, doing the legwork for the large corporate owners. In this book, it says the business Vesco originally established was an aluminum products distributor in New Jersey. Now, whether or not that connects the aluminum that this Mark Rich is doing now, I don't know. There's an article in Harper's Magazine, January 1984, How the Barbarians Do Business. And the reason I cite this is that Elliot Abrams is trying to show you that we are helping freedom fighters, that we are so caring about people and putting in democracies, and I wouldn't go to a dictatorship, and the Sultan of Brunei is nothing but a dictatorship, and South Africa is certainly a dictatorship, and they come out with the glory of we can't have those terrible Sandinistas. They don't have a newspaper to read. They closed the La Prensa. It turns out today there's an article that was run by the CIA. Of course, we knew that all along, but the people who run these investigations don't read the same things we read as they testified to. But How the Barbarians Do Business comes out of not a leftist People's World or anything, but Harper's, January 1984, and you can read that. There's another article I have from the Department of Agriculture in 1984. Well, this gentleman was shipping, of course, to South Africa. There was an embargo at that time, and he was wanted by the United States government for money that he owed millions of dollars. The Department of Agriculture awarded Mark Rich a $33 million subsidy while he was a fugitive from American justice. The giant Swiss commodities firm Mark Rich and Company, they had pleaded guilty to 28 counts of false statements. They agreed to make restitution for back taxes of $200 million, but before they did it, or meanwhile, the Department of Agriculture arranged to help Mark Rich settle his account with the Treasury Department by awarding a CCC export credit guarantee contracts, GSM-102, worth $33 million to Richco, and it helped finance his grain sales to Ecuador, which is an interesting country, and I'll get to that in 1 second in terms of Elliot Abrams and the Sultan of Brunei. And I had that on the air just about 6 months ago, an article naming Elliot Abrams as working in South America in conjunction with the Sultan of Brunei, bringing the Sikhs to retrench and arm in Ecuador, eventually to overthrow India and have a revolution there and make India safe for the Sikhs and the Punjab, who are into narcotics. That's why Mrs. Gandhi went into the temple anyway, because it was a place of narcotics traffic, and narcotics were stored there, and they were buying the weapons for the violence in India, tearing that country apart. And this article goes into Rich had behind him a string of corrupt deals involving convicted swindler Robert Vesco, another fugitive of the courts. And of course, again, Vesco is part of the Willlard Zucker operation, and Edward Bennett Williams and the Arthur Lyman, Simon Rifkin offices, and Carlos Lehder Rivas, the Colombia cocaine cartel. He's just about everywhere, and of course he was a partner of William Casey and Richard Allen in Florida and in the Azores before they went on to be promoted as chief of the CIA and national security advisor. Richard Allen was. But this Mark Rich was involved with Billy Carter, Armand Hammer, and a federal indictment was handed down in 1981 of tax evasion, fraud, racketeering violations, and RICO went to go after the organized crime arrest. The fact that he pleaded guilty doesn't matter. The point was that while he was being investigated, the USDA awarded him money for a contract for the Foreign Agriculture Service, and Undersecretary Daniel Amstutz, A-M-S-T-U-T-Z, a man in the international grain cartels, worked with the Cargill Corporation and Cargill Commodities from Switzerland that was formed in 1954. So he was awarded rewards from our agricultural department, and he was also wanted for his back taxes and couldn't come to this country. He still can't come to this country. And the article I referred to earlier was one that was printed March 1986, a year ago, about Jagin Singh Chauhan, Chauhan, again, I can't pronounce that very well, who was putting money into the newspapers in England, offering a big pot of green to kill Mrs. Gandhi. And this article I cited had to do with Ecuador being a place tied to the Israeli Mossad, to advisors in Ecuador government, to the Sultan of Brunei, that certain countries like Morocco and Brunei were dealing with the Islamic State in the northern section of the island of Borneo, and also were working, as well as Southeast Asia, with Malaysia and Singapore. And again, those are the two places where the oil was going to South Africa, and that they were setting up headquarters down in Ecuador where the Sikhs could cultivate a society not only to transfer drug traffic from Pakistan and process it, but this was a group of terrorists, also financed a lot by Ayatollah Khomeini, deeply involved in drugs, and the location for Ecuador was set up partly by U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Inter-American Affairs Elliot Abrams. So you have Abrams and the violence in Ecuador and the Brunei linked to Mark Rich, who's closely associated with Vesco, and the drug traffic of Colombia that's tied into the Christic defendants and up to the Merrill Lynch, the offices where a lot of that money was deposited, a good hunk of it, in New York City. Donald Reagan was chairman of it at the time, just moving to the Treasury Department and the White House. So I went at length about this article, or these series of articles rather, is to show you that when methinks thou protest too much, when Elliot Abrams gets up and tries to eliminate, was it 166 countries in the United Nations, he says, I won't take the right, I won't take the left, I need an oil company, and I didn't take Venezuela, so I took Brunei. Well, what he's right about, it is an oil company, and I hope a lot more comes out of it. It isn't the mandate of this investigation, but I hope a lot more comes out of it. Now, just quickly, I only have a few seconds to go. There was a lot of talk about death and suicide, that this $200,000 was set up for Ollie in case something happened to his family by Albert Hakim, and $2 million to go to him to keep the enterprise going in case Hakim died. And we don't have time now, but there was a lot of discussion about dying and death and how these people had death wishes. Robert McFarland had a death wish. The San Francisco Examiner had an article May 27th. Heavy hitters told of suicide wishes. And I think of the book, The Control of Candy Jones, how people were told to commit suicide and go down to a place like Paradise Island and dive into the rocks and eliminate yourself, probably leave a note beside it, and keep the team together, the enterprise together, but go kill yourself. I'll do more on the death theme next week. I don't have time now, and that's enough for this week. My head is really blown by these hearings. I just think it's so fascinating, and I will pick up some of those other pieces I mentioned next week and go at length with those like I did these particular items this evening. In the meantime, hear as much of the hearings as you can. There's been a recess now, but get the back tapes or wait until the transcripts come out, and I hope you read them very carefully. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week.